Every morning, at exactly 7:10, the gray cat appeared at the corner of Millbrook Street and began following the old man. It never meowed, never ran ahead, never begged. It simply walked behind him, silent, unhurried, keeping a distance of about 6 feet, like a shadow that had chosen its person and refused to let go. The old man never looked back, never waved it away, never acknowledged it at all. They moved like that through the quiet streets, one slow figure in a worn brown coat, and one small gray shape trailing behind for weeks on end. And then one morning, someone decided to follow them both. What she discovered at the end of that final street and the truth it unlocked about that cat, about that man, and about the invisible threads that keep broken things together, turned out to be nothing like what anyone had imagined. Clara Marsh had owned the corner bakery on Millbrook Street for 11 years. She opened at 6:30 every morning, which meant she was always behind her window when the old man passed, and she was always there to see the cat. The animal was a gray, short-haired. No one in the neighborhood claimed it, though a few people had tried putting food out on their stoops. The cat never touched any of it. What it did every single morning, without exception, was wait. It waited at the base of the iron lamppost on the corner, sitting perfectly still, until the old man in the brown coat appeared at the far end of the block. The moment it spotted him, it rose, stretched once, and began to move. Not toward him, not beside him, behind him. Clara noticed it first on a Tuesday in early October. She assumed it was a coincidence, the kind of thing that happens once and means nothing. But the next morning, the cat was there again. And the morning after that, by the end of the first week, she had started pausing whatever she was doing at 7:10 just to watch. There was something in the way the cat moved that she couldn't name. It wasn't the loose, distracted ambling of a stray. It was deliberate, measured. The animal kept its distance with what felt, strangely, like intention, as if it had calculated exactly how close was close enough, and had decided, long ago, not to cross that line. The old man's pace was slow, uneven at the heel. His coat was a deep brown that had faded to something between rust and fog. He carried no bag, no cane. He simply walked, and the cat simply followed. Clara told herself it was nothing. She went back to her bread dough and her morning receipts and stopped standing at the window. She lasted exactly 3 days before she was back. By the second week, Clara had begun paying attention with the focused patience of someone who suspects they are watching something important and doesn't yet know why. She noticed that the cat was never early and never late. It arrived at the lamppost between 7:04 and 7:06 each morning and was seated, waiting, well before the man turned the corner at 7:10. She had no explanation for how it knew. The street was long. The man was not visible from that position until he was already halfway down the block. She noticed that the cat matched his pace exactly. When the old man slowed to peer at a storefront window or pause at a crosswalk, the cat stopped too, no more than a half second behind him, and waited. When he moved again, the cat moved. The synchrony was close enough to unsettle her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. She noticed the route never changed. The man turned left at the dry cleaners, right at the pharmacy, and then walked the long, straight stretch of Aldine Avenue before disappearing down Cutter Lane, which dead-ended at a cluster of old row houses. The cat followed the same path every time, corner for corner, without hesitation. What the cat did not do was equally striking. It did not approach the man. It did not make noise. It did not dart ahead to rub against his legs or drop something at his feet the way cats sometimes do when they want attention. It accepted no food from anyone along the route, and by the second week, a few of the neighbors had started trying. Old Mr. Petrakis from the tobacco shop put out a small dish of cream. The woman with the terrier on Aldine broke off a piece of her breakfast and held it out. The cat looked at each offering with those amber eyes and kept walking. It behaved less like a hungry stray and more like something fulfilling an obligation. Clara's husband had died 4 years earlier. She knew, in a way she rarely admitted, what it looked like when a living thing organized its whole day around the presence of another. She recognized the shape of it even when she couldn't name the reason. She started writing things down in the margin of her order notebook. It was on a Thursday morning in the third week that Clara first felt something shift from curiosity into something with a faint edge of worry. The cat had been behaving exactly as it always did, trailing behind the old man down Aldine, maintaining its careful distance when it stopped. Not because the man had stopped. He was still moving, unhurried, another half a block ahead. But the cat halted in the middle of the sidewalk, sat down, and waited. Clara, who had been watching from the doorway of the bakery with a coffee cup in both hands, leaned forward. The cat did not look distressed. It simply sat, watching the man's retreating back with a stillness that had a quality she could not immediately identify. Then, after perhaps 40 seconds, it stood and continued walking. She asked her neighbor Margaret that evening. Margaret, who had lived on Millbrook for 30 years and knew everyone's business with a thoroughness that was occasionally alarming about the old man in the brown coat. Margaret said his name was Walter. Walter Hale. He had lived in one of the row houses on Cutter Lane for as long as she could remember, which was a very long time. He had been married once, Margaret said, a long while back. His wife had passed. He had no children that anyone knew of. He kept to himself, never made trouble, occasionally left a bag of apples on the step of the family 2 doors down, the one with the twin girls. Clara asked if he had ever owned a cat. Margaret thought about it. She said she believed he had. Years ago. A gray one, she thought, though she couldn't be sure of the color. She said she hadn't seen it in some time. Clara went home that night and lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling, turning an idea over in her mind that she was not yet willing to fully examine. The most obvious explanation was forming itself quietly in the dark. The cat had belonged to Walter once. Something had separated them, a move, an illness, the ordinary cruelties of time, and now the cat was following him, the way lost things follow the scent of what they used to have. It was trying to be taken back. It made sense. It was sad in a bearable way, the kind of sadness that resolves itself if you let it. She nearly accepted it and went to sleep. But something kept nagging at her. Something in the way the cat held its distance. Something in the way it had stopped and waited on Aldine without any obvious reason. It didn't quite fit the shape of an animal hoping to be recognized. The detail that changed everything appeared on a Friday morning. Clara almost missed it. She had turned away from the window to deal with a customer, a young woman ordering 2 croissants and an Americano. And when she looked back, the cat was still following the man down the far end of Aldine. Everything appeared the same as always, except that something was hanging from the cat's mouth. Clara set down the coffee cup hard enough to startle the young woman and pressed closer to the glass. The cat was carrying something small, a length of something thin and faded, dangling from its jaw. From this distance, she could not tell what it was. A cord, perhaps, a strip of fabric. The man ahead did not slow. He did not turn. The cat kept walking, the thing still held carefully in its teeth, as if it were something precious and not meant to be dropped. Clara watched until they turned the corner and disappeared. She thought about what she had seen for the rest of the morning. She thought about the way the cat carried it, not casually, not the way a cat carries a toy in a burst of predatory impulse. Carefully, deliberately, and when the afternoon customers had gone, and the display case was empty, and the bakery was quiet, she allowed herself to look honestly at what she had been building in her mind over the past several weeks. The cat was not begging. It was not trying to be recognized. Its eyes, when she had been close enough to see them, held none of the anxious, searching quality of an animal that wants something from you. What they held was something steadier than that, something that looked, with alarming accuracy, like vigilance. It was watching the old man, not hoping, not asking, watching. She didn't know what that meant yet, but she knew the explanation she had settled on, the simple, sad story of a cat trying to go home, was not the right one. 2 days later, Clara called in her part-time employee an hour early and told her she had an errand to run. She positioned herself on Millbrook Street before 7, wrapped in her winter coat, a thermos of coffee in her hand. She waited at the far end of the block from the lamppost, so she would not disturb the cat's routine. At 7:05, the cat arrived. It settled at the base of the lamppost, tucked its front paws under its chest, and went still. At 7:10, Walter Hale appeared. Clara fell into step on the opposite side of the street, keeping her pace even and her gaze forward in the way of someone simply walking to work. She had lived on these streets long enough that no one would look twice at her. She watched the cat follow the man for the length of Millbrook, then down to Aldine. She watched it stop when he stopped once to study a notice taped to a telephone pole, once to rebutton his coat at the collar. Each time the cat went motionless within seconds of him stopping, and resumed within seconds of him walking again. But what she had not been able to see from the bakery window, what the distance had hidden, was the angle of the cat's attention. It was not walking behind him, the way a devoted animal walks with its person, loose and trusting, attention wandering. The cat's head was up. Its ears were forward. Its gaze was fixed not on the ground in front of it, not on the street around it, but on Walter Hale, continuously, uninterruptedly, with a focus so sustained and so careful that it stopped Clara cold in the middle of the sidewalk. The cat was not following him. It was monitoring him. Walter turned down Cutter Lane at 8:22. Clara had hung back far enough that she would not have been noticed, but she was close enough to see the row of houses at the end of the lane, close enough to see Walter approach the second one from the left. She had half expected a house that looked lived in, a light in the window, maybe, or a plant in a pot by the door. What she saw instead was a house that looked like it had been left in the middle of being occupied and never returned to. The curtains were drawn. The front step had a thin ridge of dried leaves along the base that had not been cleared for some time. The mailbox was closed, but slightly crooked, as if it had been opened and shut many times, without ever being properly aligned again. The front door was unlocked. Walter opened it without a key and stepped inside. Clara stood on the sidewalk, still. The cat had stopped at the gate. Not the door, the gate at the edge of the front path. It sat there, watching the closed door, in the same posture it held every morning at the lamppost. Still, patient, fixed. Clara waited for 10 minutes. The door did not reopen. The cat did not move. She left before she could be noticed, walking quickly back to the main street, her hands wrapped around her thermos, her mind working fast. She found Walter Hale the following Tuesday afternoon. She had knocked at the gate and waited. The door opened after a long interval, and the man who stood in the doorway was older-looking than she had expected up close. His face was calm in the particular way of someone who has long since stopped anticipating surprise. His eyes were clear, pale, gray, like old glass, but there was something in them she recognized after a few seconds. A slight vacancy at the center, a faint lag between what he saw and what he made of it. She introduced herself as the woman from the bakery on Millbrook. She said she had noticed him on his morning walks. He invited her in without any apparent suspicion, as if people knocked on his door with some regularity, which she already suspected was not true. The inside of the house was clean but spare. Everything was in its place in the careful way of someone who has given a great deal of thought to where things should go and what might happen if they moved. A single chair faced the window. A mug was positioned exactly in the center of the kitchen table. There was a coat rack by the door with one coat on it. They sat. She asked gentle questions. He answered them with a candor that told her he had either forgotten what privacy felt like or simply no longer needed it. He told her about his walk. He said he had been taking it for years, the same route, the same time, every morning. He said it helped him remember the day. He said some mornings were easier than others. Then Clara asked about the cat. Walter was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window. He said he had owned a cat once. He said it had been gray. He said he could not always recall its name without effort, but that he remembered the weight of it on his lap in the evenings, and the way it had sat in the window of this very room, watching the street. He said it had been gone for some time now. He said he thought it had wandered off. He said he sometimes wondered where it had gone. He said all of this slowly, in the way of someone reading from a page that is faded in places, working around the gaps. Clara felt the words land on her like water. The cat had not wandered off. The cat was outside the gate right now, had been outside the gate every single morning for however many weeks or months it had been doing this, sitting in the cold and the rain and the pale October light, watching the front door to make sure Walter came back out. The cat was not following Walter Hale because it wanted something from him. The cat was following him because Walter Hale got lost, not dramatically, not in the cinematic way of a person who disappears and is found miles from home, but in the small, daily way of someone whose map of the world has begun to dissolve at the edges, who sometimes pauses at a corner and cannot immediately locate himself, who sometimes turns the wrong direction and stands still for a moment too long before the familiar detail of a storefront or a mailbox pulls him back. The cat followed him to make sure he found his way home. The distance it kept, the careful, deliberate 6 feet, was not emotional restraint. It was strategy. An animal smart enough to understand that its person startled easily now, that a sudden presence too close would stop him, confuse him, send him sideways, so it stayed back. 6 feet, far enough to be invisible to a distracted mind, close enough to do something if needed. Clara sat in Walter's kitchen for a long time without speaking. When she finally did, her voice came out different than she'd expected. She drove home that evening and sat in her own kitchen, with her hands flat on the table, staring at nothing. She thought about how many mornings the cat had done this. She thought about the early weeks, before she had started noticing the weeks before October, and perhaps before that, the month she could not account for. She thought about the rain she had seen on the streets in September, and she thought about a gray cat sitting at a lamppost in the rain, waiting for a man who no longer always knew his own route home. Walter did not remember the cat's name most mornings. He had said so himself without knowing what he was saying, that he had to work for it, that it didn't always come. The cat remembered everything. It remembered his schedule, his route, the time it took him to walk each block, the way he sometimes stopped too long at the corner of Aldine and stood without moving. It had learned all of it, the pattern of him, the geography of his ordinary day, and it had reorganized its own life around keeping him inside it. Clara thought about the object the cat had carried in its mouth on Friday morning. She thought it might have been an old cord, the kind a cat toy or an ID tag hangs from, the kind a cat might carry the way a person carries a photograph, not because it does anything, because it is the shape of something that used to matter. She thought about the way the cat's eyes held no trace of pleading, and she understood now that this was not because it had given up hoping to be recognized. It was because being recognized was no longer the point. Walter Hale was the point. Making sure Walter Hale got up the front walk and through the door at the end of every morning was the only point there was. She cried quietly for a few minutes. Then she dried her face and opened her phone. Clara called the neighborhood social services office the following morning. She explained what she had observed, described Walter's condition as gently and accurately as she could, and asked what resources were available for elderly residents living alone. The woman on the other end of the line was patient and thorough. She said someone could visit within the week. Clara also started stopping by Cutter Lane on her way home in the evenings. She brought things: soup in a jar, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, a small bag of coffee grounds, because she had noticed the tin in his kitchen was almost empty. Walter always answered the door. He always let her in. He sometimes seemed uncertain, on the second or third visit, exactly how he knew her, but he accepted her presence with the ease of someone who has decided that most things entering his life are probably fine. A caseworker named Diane began coming twice a week. She helped Walter organize his medications, checked the heating, installed a small lock mechanism on the front door that required a deliberate action to open, not to cage him, but to slow the moments when he turned toward the door without quite knowing why. The cat continued its morning walks. Clara began timing herself to pass the corner of Millbrook at 7:10, not to interfere, but simply to see. She watched the cat rise from the lamppost and fall into step behind Walter with the same unhurried precision it had always shown. She watched the 6 feet of distance hold, steady as a measurement, morning after morning. And then, on a Thursday in late November, a cold morning, the sky the color of old pewter, she saw Walter slow as he passed the dry cleaners. He stopped. He turned, not toward the shop, but toward the street behind him. The cat stopped too, immediately. Walter looked at it for a long moment. Not with confusion, not with fear, with something that Clara, watching from the bakery doorway with a dish towel forgotten in her hand, could only describe as the expression of a person trying to remember the name of a song they have known for most of their life. His lips moved slightly. He said something, one word, or maybe two, and then he turned and kept walking. Clara did not hear it. She was too far away. But the cat's ears shifted forward at the sound, and for one brief second, before it resumed its careful, measured pace, it looked like an animal that had just heard something it had been waiting a very long time to hear. By the first week of December, Diane had arranged for a morning check-in service. A volunteer named Ray stopped by Cutter Lane at 7 to make sure Walter had eaten and was ready for his walk. The house was warmer, the front step had been cleared. There was a small plant on the kitchen windowsill, not Clara's doing, but Diane's, and Walter had asked about it twice, each time with something approaching pleasure. The morning walk continued. Walter was not ready to give it up, and no one suggested he should. It was part of his structure, part of what tethered him to the shape of the day. The route remained the same: left at the dry cleaners, right at the pharmacy, down Aldine, left onto Cutter. The cat remained the same too. Same lamppost, same 7:05 arrival, same 6 feet of distance, same steady, unblinking vigil for the full length of every street. Clara had begun to think that this was simply how it would be, the careful equilibrium they had all settled into, each of them holding their position at exactly the right interval from one another. Then on a morning just before Christmas, something changed. Clara saw it happen. She was at the bakery window with her second coffee, and Walter had just turned onto Millbrook from the far end of the block, moving at his usual pace. The cat rose from the lamppost as always, stretched as always, and began to follow. But this morning, a few houses past the bakery, Walter slowed and stopped. He stood still for a moment in the way he sometimes did, the small internal pause, the recalibration. Clara watched, breath held. Then Walter turned. He looked down at the cat, which had stopped behind him as always, sitting perfectly still on the frost-edged sidewalk, amber eyes fixed on his face. Something in Walter's expression shifted. It moved through uncertainty and came out the other side as something softer and older. He crouched down slowly, one hand on his knee, and held out his hand. The cat looked at the hand for a long moment, long enough that Clara found she was holding her breath. Then it walked forward. It closed the 6 feet between them in unhurried steps, and when it reached Walter's outstretched hand, it pressed the side of its face against his knuckles and stayed there. Walter made a sound that Clara could not hear through the glass. His other hand came up and rested on the cat's back, and his shoulders dropped, the way shoulders drop when something that has been held for a very long time is finally allowed to release. They stayed like that for almost a minute. A cold morning in December, the street quiet, the frost still on the pavement. Then Walter straightened, turned, and continued down Millbrook, and the cat walked beside him, not behind him, not at 6 feet, beside him close enough that if Walter had reached down, he could have touched it without taking a step. The distance that had been maintained for so many months, with such deliberate and patient precision, was simply gone. Clara stood at her window until they turned the corner and disappeared. She thought about that morning for a long time afterward. She thought about what the cat had known, for all those months of quiet and rain and distance that no one else had seen. She thought about the discipline of it, the choosing, every morning, to stay close enough to help but far enough not to frighten, the willingness to be unrecognized, unrewarded, unknown, if that was what was needed. There is a particular kind of love that does not ask to be seen, that does not require its own name to be spoken, or its history to be remembered. That persists not because it is returned, but because stopping never becomes an option, because the other person still has a route to walk and a door to reach, and someone needs to make sure they find it. Clara thought about her husband. She thought about the years after, and the way grief had moved through her house like weather. She thought about what she had not known what the cat had. Somehow, always known about what it means to follow someone not because you want something from them, but because they need you to be there. The cat had not been looking for recognition. It had been looking after someone. Some mornings after that, walking to the bakery in the early gray of December, Clara would see the two figures ahead of her on the street, the old man in the worn brown coat, and beside him, close enough to touch, a small gray shape moving steadily forward. Two shadows occupying the same patch of cold winter light, going the same direction. She never called out to them. She didn't need to. She just watched them walk, and let the sight of them carry what it carried, and understood in the way you understand things that don't need words, that love does not always need to be remembered to still be true. It only needs to not walk away.